love that he had for the African American people, and his commitment, not just for the African American people, as we're going to talk about. He had this kind of radical love for everyone, even his enemies, but certainly a commitment to champion the concerns of the dispossessed and the marginalized, right? Again, that said, we also have to recognize that, you know, some of his positions may go very much counter to what we believe and how we're supposed to practice our deen, right? That said, we can recognize that there were tactics and philosophical positions that are very much compatible with Islam and very much useful for us as African American Muslims moving forward, and definitely recognize the incredible sacrifice that he made for people who were, again, on the margins of society. So the radical king. So this is a quote. This is not my own quote. This comes from a historian by the name of Cornel West, who actually has a book called The Radical King, which is actually a pretty decent read. And in this text, Dr. West talks about how King's legacy specifically has been misused and misappropriated and distorted by people who in life would have hated him, right? And sometimes they were alive when he was alive and did hate him and opposed him, right? The fact is, serious social scientists who studied King emphasize his revolutionary agenda. He did have a revolutionary agenda, especially in comparison to the status quo that exists in the United States at that time, and it continues to exist. Dr. King emphasized economic, social, and political reforms that were quite revolutionary. And in fact, these social sciences claim, and specifically Dr. West claims, and I think it's a valid claim, he had become more of a democratic socialist. He, in fact, said as much in the year before he was assassinated. Towards the end of his life, he came out very strongly against the Vietnam War and kind of articulated in no uncertain terms that there was a connection between United States imperialism abroad and the racial and economic injustice domestically, right? You know, and again, these developments in his political trajectory are what many consider radical, even as they frame them, however, within the context of reform rather than actual revolution and all that entails. One of the more oft-cited or oft-repeated quotes of Dr. King, or that's attributed to Dr. King, is this quote: "The arc of moral justice is long, but it bends towards justice." And this is a pretty powerful quote. It's often misused. It's often, you can find it quoted from people who are straight out borderline fascists to people who are progressives and all that is in between. The gist of the quote, right, is that it's supposed to be about recognizing some sort of cosmic justice, right, that exists in the universe, right, and also to embody hope, right, that through doing good works by pushing for change, right, even if we don't experience that change in our lifetime, having faith that there is a spiritual being, in our case, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that at the end is going to establish justice. Justice will be established, right? President Obama, the first African-American president, was actually quite fond of deploying this quote as a symbolic gesture of kind of optimism in the innate goodness of the human spirit and the inevitability of justice. Again, I don't want to get into a whole discussion about President Obama, but certainly his policies did not embody the revolutionary agenda of Dr. King, and certainly not any, serious embrace of economic and social justice, right? And again, many people are also drawn to his "I Have a Dream" speech. And I know with my own U.S. history classes and even African-American history classes, if there's no other speech people remember, it's that speech, right? The "I have a dream that one day," something to the effect about little black boys and little black girls will hold hands together in school and it won't be an issue, right? And, similarly to this quote, this speech, like I said, it's probably the only one most people know of, most Americans know about, declares and celebrates the universality of humanity, right? It's a very anti-racist speech on its face. It also emphasizes the innate human aspiration for brotherhood, love, and justice, right? This idea of universal brotherhood, innate goodness of humanity, but also it kind of plays with this notion of colorblindness. And in this way, this is one way in which people who live their lives and actively push for policies extremely destructive to Black and brown people appropriate his language and his legacy with this kind of hinting of colorblindness, and then they then take it and remodel it in this very simplistic way. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But as much as you have people like that the senator of Kentucky and these other, I forget his name, doesn't matter anyway, but these people who on his King, they tweet out, how they're all about King's legacy and all about King's dream and this sort of thing. In life, they absolutely, again, they don't recognize, first of all, we would never have supported him in life. And a lot of this erases the fact that by the end of his life, in the last year or two of his life, Dr. King was extremely unpopular amongst white people in the United States, right? His public disapproval rating amongst white, just in general, was about 75%, right? He was also under the constant surveillance of the FBI, who had engaged in like a 7 or 8 year long campaign to discredit and destroy him by surveillance, blackmailing him. However, he was accused of being a troublemaker, an extremist, even a traitor and a communist stooge, right? And this was all, in fact, in the state, and this was all despite the fact that he very stubbornly adhered to this nonviolent philosophy. More than just a tactic for him, it was a philosophy, it was a way of life that insisted upon loving one's enemy, one's enemy, like who wants to kill you and hurt you and kill your children, that despite this, you should love them. And also an insistence upon the importance of helping the weakest members of society, and really a complete and utter dedication to the most pacifistic and gentlest interpretation of the biblical gospels that one could have adopted, right? And yet, even with all of this, he was still quite a polarizing figure by the end of his life. And so so I want to take it back a little bit and look at, how did King end up as kind of this iconic figure, right? And where did he start? Well, at the age of 26 in 1955, Dr. King basically was the kind of default individual to be the public face of a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, right? And he was selected to be kind of the public face of that boycott because he was young. He was only 26 years old. He was not from Montgomery, Alabama. The perception was that if it all went wrong, the older, more established clergy felt if it all went wrong, he could always move and reestablish himself somewhere else. But the thing is, this turned out to be a success. And this is when he begins to articulate a very, I would say, is a very unusual approach to achieving what had evaded the grasp of African-American people in the United States for over 300 years. And that was a simple recognition of the humanity of Black people, right? And he was somewhat successful in achieving that, getting a pretty racist white America to look at Black people and see them as belonging to the human family, right? And he did this by basically preaching this what appeared to many white people to be a very non-threatening philosophy of nonviolent resistance, this idea of loving one's enemy, never defending oneself against violence. And what he hoped to do with this was to appeal to the moral consciousness of white people in the United States. He deeply believed in the so-called foundational principles of the Republic. And when I say foundational, I'm not talking about slavery and dispossession of the indigenous people, although it is. He kind of, I mean, he talks about that, but he really believed in the language embodied in the Constitution, right, about equality and the Bill of Rights, right, and then the Reconstruction Amendments. He really believed that America was a place where one could achieve justice and equality, right? And he basically challenged white America, but specifically challenged white liberals and progressive rights, right, to basically live up to these principles, right, that they claimed that they believed in, much as Frederick Douglass had done, less than 100 years earlier, right? And, the problem that he experienced, especially with white liberals, to the extent that at one point he said, the real opposition to civil rights and equality in this country are not the White Citizens Council, the Ku Klux Klan, or the Jim Crow South, but it's really the white liberals, right, who are constantly counseling patients, who are constantly counseling him to hold back, insisting that he obey the law, right? When entire states in the South are disobeying the law, right? And, this is what he faced. His achievements are many, we have to admit. Dr. King was not unsuccessful. I mean, given, again, what he was up against, right? His tireless efforts did, in fact, at the very least, I'll admit, twinge the conscience of many white Americans, probably not the majority of them, but, enough. He's an incredibly eloquent speaker. He was good at changing minds, and he would really move people when he spoke. He either engaged in and or supported direct action campaigns in conjunction with groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress for Racial Equality. And his campaigns in the South, his nonviolent campaign, right, in the South, did in fact result in 2 Civil Rights Acts, which were pretty transformational. Well, the Voting Rights Act, of course, has been gutted. It means almost nothing now, and we'll talk about that when we get to the end. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were significant legislative achievements that can be attributed to him and his movement, primarily in the South. And so he did successfully dismantle the kind of blatant codified racial apartheid of the South, right? So the colored only and the whites only signs came down and this sort of thing, right? On the surface, right? The state was prohibited from engaging in blatant segregation, blatant racist policies, right? And that we cannot take from him. And of course, there's a lot of blowback from that, and we'll talk about that as well. But, Dr. King also pointed out and confronted the universality of oppression of all marginalized people in the United States, right? He addressed issues of race and class in ways that definitely are not talked about now. He was concerned for the plight of indigenous people, Latinos, poor whites, as well as African Americans, right? I think that he did a good job of getting the white supremacists to expose themselves through his nonviolent philosophy, right? And it was while it's something a lot of people would not choose to do, and I think I'm not going to say it's un-Islamic, but I think most Muslims would not. I would say it's probably un-Islamic to stand by and watch your women and children get harmed without defending them. But in doing so, his tactic did get these people exposed who they were. These racist terrorists in police uniform and out of police uniform, water hose people, beat people, set dogs on them, murdered people. And this exposed to the whole country just how dysfunctional and how blatantly evil white supremacy could be, right? Furthermore, he did make a connection very publicly between racism, classism, and economic injustice in the United States. And he linked this all to United States foreign policy, right? And racism and imperialism globally, right? Particularly when he gave his speech Beyond Vietnam, where he condemns U.S. involvement in Vietnam. In the last year of his life, he spoke of the United States as a, quote, greatest purveyor of violence in the world, unquote. And this really didn't sit well with a lot of people. He condemned the, quote, giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism, unquote, as the ultimate destroyers of humanity and of the United States if they were not confronted and eradicated. So his the radical message of Dr. King was declaring that there must be what he called a true revolution of values, right? In order to create a human order in which people were valued above things and capital, and that the brutal injustice, the suffering, and the oppression of marginalized people could not be accepted, right? You know, so, and he actually tried to, you know, he really believed that you could use the United States government to further these, to reach these goals and to further these aims, right? King is assassinated in April of 1968. In the context, by the time he's killed, he is not this beloved figure that people try to recreate or pretend this was the case in 1968. That, I mean, the closest he would have come to that would have been maybe the mid to early 60s, right? But as he starts to talk more about economic injustice, and in fact, when he's murdered, he's gone to Memphis to support a garbage worker strike, right? And what happens in Memphis, the thing about King is throughout his career, and I'd say dating at least back to 1961, 62, Dr. King is being heavily surveilled, constantly surveilled by the FBI. The FBI surveilled King, and in fact would go on to murder people like Fred Hampton, Bunchy Carter, are arranged for the murder of Black liberation figures through a program called COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program. And in these documents, and you can look them up online, if you know, to find them for yourself, they're actually available. There's a lot of it that's redacted, but you can kind of make your way through it and you can make sense of it. In these documents, the FBI is very much afraid of a rise of a so-called Black Messiah, right? And Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were the two figures they feared the most in terms of doing that. Their idea of their Black Messiah, as they put it, will be a political or spiritual leader who could unite African-American people and perhaps unite them with working class people of other ethnicities and bring about some sort of revolution in the United States. So when King is in Memphis in 1968, the FBI used their media tactics to basically smear him because he was staying in a hotel that was owned, was white-owned. It was white-owned. It was I believe it was a Holiday Inn. So they basically used the media tactics to put out a story that he was a hypocrite because he was urging a boycott of white businesses, right? Because of the boycotts, because of the garbage strike, and here he is staying in a white-owned hotel. So he moved to the only African-American hotel in town before he is then murdered by a man, a well-known terrorist, operating along with the Klan and the White Citizens Council, all of whom enjoyed like incredible protection from the Southern Democratic Party, from the political infrastructure of Tennessee. And so he's murdered while under the surveillance of the FBI. Of course, you know, James Earl Ray later on is arrested. The whole lone gunman theory is still kind of, there's some archives that are supposed to be released, I think, in a few years, but they're still sticking by their lone gunman theory that James Earl Ray acted alone. And at this time, COINTELPRO as an operation is not known yet to the public. But when he's murdered, a couple things happen. First of all, there's a great deal of, there is a kind of outpouring of superficial grief from the white community, a little bit of public flagellation, kind of, I don't want to call it guilt, but certainly the question, oh, could we have done more, and this sort of thing. Much like what happened after George Floyd was murdered, right? But this was followed immediately by fear, horror, and a retreat kind of to ignite white supremacy, certainly white privilege, as there's urban uprisings all over the country over the murder of Dr. King, right? And so, in the face of these uprisings, you have this white backlash. And the uprisings are really about a lot of young people seeing that nonviolence as a tactic and philosophy was not enough at the very least. And also, I think even a lot of people who may have not, African Americans who may have rejected King's philosophy, right? And maybe not even were that crazy about his public posture, were just horrified by the fact that the man who had said he loved his enemies, swore to nonviolence, could be murdered like this, right? And so in the face of this white backlash and these urban uprising, in the 1968 elections, the Republican Party takes office under Richard Nixon, campaigning under the Law and Order platform. And this is the beginning of kind of the strangling of Dr. King's legacy and his dream in the crib, basically. The Southern Democrats at this point are that they'd been the party of slavery, they'd been the party of Jim Crow. At this point, what the Republicans do is start to court them using coded words like law and order, basically promising to crack down on Black people, specifically Black militants. There's an expansion of police power, as this is when SWAT is invented. Starting in Los Angeles, then spreading throughout the country, special weapons and tactics teams. COINTELPRO is in full effect, right? Subverting and murdering and otherwise destroying Black liberation movements. And under the guise of the war on crime and then the war on drugs, policing of Black communities becomes very aggressive and very, very authoritarian. So this is when you begin to see mass incarceration. You see the example in upstate New York, or excuse me, in the state of New York, you have the passing of the so-called Rockefeller laws. And these were laws that gave these very draconian sentences for the possession of drugs, right? And so if you got caught with a kilo of heroin, you automatically got like a life sentence. And a lot of what's going on during this period under COINTELPRO is that criminal informants, agent provocateurs, and other opportunists are kind of joining these Black liberation movements and feeding information to the federal authorities while engaging in criminal activities at the same time, right? And you have also this in conjunction with basically a state-sanctioned murder by the police, murder by the FBI of Black liberation movements. So in the aftermath of his death, by the time you get to 1964, right, when Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, who, by the way, while he was in office, he vociferously and very aggressively went after the Black Panther Party. He suspended open carry laws. He tried to have Angela Davis executed for conspiracy to commit murder, right? And he ends up running for the presidency in 1984. He kicks off his campaign in a place called Philadelphia, Mississippi. Now, some of you probably recognize the name of that place, because that place not only was a bastion of violent white supremacists and terrorists, but it also was a place where 16 years earlier, 3 SNCC workers, right, 1 Black man and 2 white men who were working for SNCC, were kidnapped by the local police, by the literal police, taken out somewhere and executed, beaten and executed, right? These were policemen. They did not do it in the course of an arrest or a traffic stop. They actually stopped them for a broken taillight, held them in jail until nighttime, let them go, and then they just disappeared. It came out later that they had murdered these men. So this is a place that was, and they only did a few years in prison. It was, and this was only because the feds went after them, because there was no way the state was going to be able to seat a jury that would have convicted him. So this was a bastion of white supremacy, a bastion of white supremacist terrorism. And Reagan goes there talking about restoring states' rights. And here's a picture of him giving his speech in a state that's like 40% African-American. There's not a black base in the crowd, as you can see. So this is when the Southern strategy that I spoke of earlier really begins to consume the Republican Party, right? And the new right, which is very much consists of former Southern Democrats, becomes a very strong base for the Republican Party. The Republicans basically harnessed white resentment, white racism against Black people, and a ploy to gain power, which they used to further entrench this extreme materialism that King had talked about in his lifetime, these vast inequities in wealth, and to furthermore, right, continue on its project of militaristic imperialism all over the planet. Again, something else that Dr. King had very forcefully condemned while he was alive. Kind of the kind of end story of this that all of us know, right, is that eventually this faction of the new right, and it's not to say that all of the Republicans and a lot of the Democrats are racist on some level of the spectrum, but within the Southern and the Republican Party, you had a dedicated, committed group of people who had been former Democrats who wanted to bring back the racial status quo, right? And eventually the Republican Party, as we see now, has totally lost control in the sense that those are the people who now run the party, right? A very unvarnished and unapologetic articulation of white supremacy, and I would argue neo-fascism is now what the Republican Party is. So in terms of, again, King's radical agenda, and one of the most successful of his legislative achievements was the Voting Rights Act. And this, of course, was just recently destroyed with Shelby versus Holder in 2013. And this basically gutted the section of the Voting Rights Act that basically has stated that states that had a history, especially states that had a history of passing laws keeping African Americans from voting, could not change voting laws without them being vetted by the Justice Department, right? And so the Justice Department had a great deal of oversight in terms of changing these laws. And the Supreme Court, basically under Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, basically said this was no longer needed. The country has come a long way. We've elected our first Black president. It's not 1954 anymore, and literally guts this, okay? So, this is kind of interesting that as soon as this happens, immediately you see a resurgence of the passing of laws designed to keep African-American people from voting. You see the gerrymandering, and I like to use this map as an example of voting districts to make sure that there's no Black majorities. This is basically the state of Tennessee, North Carolina, and you can see where they've created these districts that really make no sense, right? Look at this one, it looks like a snake, right? But that's in order to keep African Americans from having representation in Congress, basically, right? And then, of course, with the rise of the rise of the new fascist movement, right? Neo-fascism in the election of Donald Trump in 2006, it is the Southern strategy and the resilience of white supremacy is really just telling us that the inescapable conclusion is that King's vision, his radical vision, is in fact incompatible with the people in the nation that he wanted it for. And I'm going to quote Black Power proponent and formerly the head of SNCC, Stokely Carmichael, who said, quote, "In order for nonviolent resistance to work, your opponent has to have a conscience." And I don't think that I'm being, I don't think this is hyperbole for me to say this, right? That, over the last 10 or more years, I can't count how many times over and over again, if you choose to, which I stopped doing, you can go on the internet and watched young Black boys and men be shot down in the street like dogs, right? This is streamed live into the little devices we carry around, right? And again, thanks to, kind of the postmodern internet world, we now can see the brutality that so many of us knew has been around, but before, since, and after the modern civil rights movement. And the response of that was not like a deep soul searching kind of questioning, national kind of rending of garments and moral transformation of society as we try to figure out why is this happening, right? More, I would say significantly more than half of the vocal voting or non-voting population of white America not only doesn't care, but actually would actually go further to say that they justify this violence, right? And that it's necessary in order to establish law and order, in order to for policemen to be able to do their jobs, etc. Now, the genuine student of U.S. history isn't surprised by this. The retrenchment of white supremacy is real. After every kind of forward movement, the end of slavery, the end of Reconstruction, right? The end of the Civil Rights Movement, the election of the first Black president, after every slight step forward, there's always this backlash, right? And, when you think about the history, when you think about, for example, spectacle lynchings, and if you're not familiar with spectacle lynchings, they were basically these communal events that would take place, and not just in the South. There were some in Oklahoma, there were some in Michigan, there were some in Indiana, in Nebraska, right? Where a Black man usually, and sometimes a Black woman, would be kidnapped by a mob, would be tortured to death in some of the most medieval kind of tortures you can think of, and often burned alive in front of crowds of people that often included families who went there to picnic and enjoy a nice sunny afternoon. And then postcards would be made of photographs of this carnage, and there was actually quite a lively trade in selling and trading these postcards. Not to mention kind of the race massacres of Tulsa, Oklahoma, Chicago, Illinois, East St. Louis, Atlanta, Georgia. These are just some. Elaine, Arkansas, right? The list is endless, right? So the fact that white supremacy is so deeply retrenched, and the fact that people are not necessarily really uncomfortable with the execution of young Black men by, the officers of the state for minor infractions. It's not that surprising that this is still the case. Well, there has been kind of, there's been representation. Yes, we had a Black president. We have 2 Black senators. There's certainly more Black policemen, right? But representation, yes, but no real systemic change, right? And the lynchings that's just become more high tech with the internet, and really kind of there's still this overwhelming support for the status quo in terms of state violence directed, particularly against Black people, but also when we look at how immigrants were treated, Latino immigrants, specifically brown immigrants, Black and brown immigrants were treated on the Texas border, for example, and children put in cages and that sort of thing. And then the kind of justification is, well, they broke the law, and people are kind of okay with that. So, there is this historical continuity. Dr. King's radical vision was to dismantle white supremacy, and really, and for him that encompasses the erasure of social and economic injustice, right? So it's no accident, really, when we think about it, that that people want to rewrite that history. I'll say specifically racist people want to rewrite that history, right? And kind of make King into something that he is not, right? And, when we look at spectacle lynchings, and we look at race massacres, and we look at, for example, the response by the police departments, the rank and file police has been to Black Lives Matter, which I'm not I'm not kind of condoning Black Lives Matter, let me tell you. I'm saying that Black Lives Matter was a pretty benign movement. It was not militant at all. But their response has been a kind of neo-fascist movement. Blue Lives Matter with an altered U.S. flag that has become like an emblem of neo-fascists now. And you have these groups like the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers, right, who have now formed these kind of armed militias. And really, it's all very open now. Nothing is being hidden at all. So, you know, a lot of how these fascists and these racists, excuse me, sorry about that, didn't mean to do that. These racists and fascists have co-opted his vision, and his language was this idea of colorblindness, coming back to the notion of colorblindness. And it comes from that speech, right, at the March of Washington. And, you know, they kind of warp this into this notion of just, it's less about colorblindness than it is about ignoring the historical, right, and the ongoing oppression, violence, and terrorism that Black and brown people have faced and continue to face in this country. And in fact, they turn it around to argue that the people who are the most oppressed are whites, in fact, because whites are having their privileges taken away as Americans, right? And so, you know, while in death, it can be very useful for these folks to cherry pick his ideology. His living legacy is much more problematic unless they control the narrative, right? And I think it's important for us to understand that even reformers have to kind of deal with this fact that in order to make real the radical tradition of Dr. King, that would necessitate the destruction of institutions that continue to perpetuate these evils, right? The paradox is that white America benefits from the existence of these institutions, right? And refuses to see them as part and parcel of white supremacy as an ideology. They refuse to see white supremacy as wed into the system, right? And they're kind of onto something, because the fact is that white supremacy is a vital and integral part of the social, economic, and cultural fabric of this nation, right? You know, and most likely, and King warned of this, white supremacy as an ideology, as a system woven into the institutions and the systems in this country will probably eventually destroy this republic, right? And King predicted as much before he was struck down by the very agents of this pernicious ideology. So, in conclusion, how do we understand King, and how do we as Muslims, and I guess this was kind of what I wrestle with in terms of when I think about King. If you ever have an opportunity to kind of review, like there's a book called The FBI and Dr. Martin Luther King that really goes into kind of their surveillance of him and their attempts to destroy him. I think it's important to read that to kind of understand who King was, and also understand the extent to which the state was against him, right? And also when we look at the you know, Dr. King's philosophy, we must recognize the good in it, right? And recognize that, you know, like all of us, he came from Allah, he returned to Allah, right? And he was one of the Ahl Kitab, one of the people of the book. And some of these things that he spoke of, this is part of our tradition. And we should be in the forefront talking about our responsibility to the poor and the marginalized, right? We should be about anti-materialism. We should be anti-racist and about creating a racially egalitarian society. We should be fighting injustice in however small way we can. And we certainly have a strong tradition, and I think a profound understanding of the importance of sacrifice, right? the sacrifice of the one for the good of humanity, right? Muslims in the United States should openly oppose white supremacy, whether it benefits us or we suffer from it, right? We should oppose it because it is un-Islamic and it is thoroughly evil. And we must take it even further and understand it. In order to do so, we must first create alternative spaces like y'all have done with this type of sort of thing, where we can talk amongst each other. We can design our own strategies and our own philosophies, political philosophies and social philosophies, grounded in our tradition, in the Sharia. We need to create alternative systems of power, right? And this, there's all this talk of abolishing the police, because I agree, you call the police, most of the time they're going to do more harm than good. But you have to have some alternative, right? We have to police ourselves, and we have to figure out ways of doing that, right? And we must build a more just society based upon our principles, our Islamic principles, right? We must stand with the oppressed and avoid the company of powerful people in this system just because they're powerful and they can give us something, right? Because that integrates us into an evil system that we're going to continue to perpetuate an evil system, which I think, King, if nothing else, demonstrated, right, that there is no reforming, right? Because as I said, King's vision of reform and nonviolent revolution was predicated upon appealing to the conscience of white America, right? And this, while noble, failed immeasurably. The sheer resilience and tenacity of white supremacy and its advocates and supporters is such that the system he fought against required a much more radical response, a much more radical tactic, and I would argue the beginning of a complete separation from its infrastructure as much as you can. So in closing, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us, the believers who find ourselves in the midst of this depraved and evil system, right? Gives us victory over it and the shayateen who wield power in its name in order to oppress and destroy the lives of millions. And I ask Allah to grant us that as Muslims, even if it doesn't happen in our lifetime, to inshallah happen in the lifetime of our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. Ameen.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So inshallah, I'm sure you guys have seen me spamming this in the chat. If you have any questions, we're going to go into the Q&A now. You can just drop your question in the chat and we'll get to it. I have a list of what we have already. I would also just like to say, if you want to stay on top of events we do or join our reading group, our Instagram is Al-Jasad510. It's Al-Jasad510. And you can stay on top of everything we're doing there. And we're actually going to have a reading group that's starting in February for Black History Month. And we're going to be reading some texts that will actually explore the civil rights movement around some of the same time period of, the era we've been talking about. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and get into the questions. So the first question we actually got before the event even started, someone dropped in our the RSVP form, and we have another question now that's actually asking the same thing. And it was about whether or not Martin Luther King was a Zionist. And another person just now asked in the chat earlier, I'm wondering about the arc of Dr. King's thoughts. I'm wondering about the arc of Dr. King's thoughts with Zionism. Did he denounce it at one point?
Okay, I looked into that. I had always felt that he was, but I wanted to look into it. So last night and today I did. Publicly, okay, so he said publicly, I support the existence of the state of Israel. Black people should support the existence of the state of Israel, and the United States should ensure the security and safety of Israel. So for me, that means he was a Zionist. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of, we can take some of the good, and we got to leave the stuff that goes against what we believe and what we believe to be just. Privately, that said, I want to be fair to him and say that privately, he was disturbed by the violence and the dispossession and the treatment of Palestinian people. In fact, so disturbed, I believe it was after the war, right after the war of 1967, he avoided going on a trip to Jerusalem. The Israelis were very keen on getting him to go to Jerusalem and kind of, frankly, using him, right, as a kind of political prop to show they're on the side of righteousness, and he avoided doing that because he wasn't comfortable with it. The simple answer to your question is yes, he was a Zionist, and I think you'll find that most American Christians are in fact Zionists.
Thank you for that. No, I think that's a really important question and a very important topic to explore. Yeah, particularly because I think oftentimes in our day and age, especially on social media, there's like a lack of nuance, and people want to just either want to adopt historical figures and say that, oh, they're just totally in line with my stance, or just like discard them. So I'm glad that we can, explore that nuance here.
Do you want me to answer the questions that are in the chat, or do you want to just feed?
I have them all written down, so we're going to work through them.
Okay, cool.
I see someone has their hand raised. Oh, excuse me. Go ahead.
Whoops.
I was going to say, I see someone has their hand raised. If you have a question, just drop it in the chat and we'll go through it there. The next question was, do you feel that the misrepresentation of Dr. King's colorblind ideals was an intentional attempt to deter people away from his advocacy for Black people in the diaspora to better understand their cultural lineage and gain knowledge of self? That's a long one, so let me know if you want me to repeat it.
Yeah, I can see it. Okay, so the misrepresentation of his colorblind ideals, there's a lot of stuff going on there. First of all, a lot of racists tend to use it nowadays, right? Say, this is what a king wanted. He wanted everything to be colorblind. So, you can't have an affirmative action kind of thing. Also, I think there is something to you talking about this intentional attempt to deter people away from his advocacy for Black people in diaspora for better understanding their cultural lineage. Yes, I think that when people of African descent tend to assert their cultural identity as African people, it challenges the narrative of white supremacy, and people get very uncomfortable. Hence, people not liking that there's a Black History Month or a Black Student Union saying, why can't there be a white one? When what that's really about is once you embrace your own ethnic kind of cultural background, then you're kind of arguing against assimilation into the more superior one. So yeah, that would be the best answer I can give to your question, except to say that color blindness has become like the new racism. And in fact, a lot of these straight up fascists use it. In fact, there's a case being argued now that Asian students are being discriminated against at Harvard at the expense of Black students, that Black students are being let in and Asians aren't. And white supremacists are like in the forefront of that, arguing, oh yeah, it should be all colorblind kind of thing.
Sure. All right. The next question was, could you maybe speak on whether Dr. King ever tapped into the anti-colonial struggles that were happening across the global South during his time?
I just want to think about that for a while.
No problem.
When I think of Dr. King and his anti-imperialist stances, I think of from the moment he made that speech in the Riverside Church in 1967 in Harlem, Beyond Vietnam. And in that speech, it's chock full of examples of US imperialism. And then even later on, he talks about capitalists investing in like South America, right, in mining concerns and pulling great profit out of these regions because of the natural resources. Meanwhile, the workers are living under the worst kind of conditions, right? I believe he even spoke on like Patrice Lumumba, I might be mistaken, but he certainly, I think Vietnam, the war in Vietnam was really this kind of analytical lens through which he talked about, this is a racist war, and a lot of the dynamic of what's going on in Vietnam is reflected in the racial dynamics of the United States at the time. But I would argue, I would say, and no disrespect to Dr. King, that he was a little bit late to the game. Malcolm X was more the global, more the internationalist in terms of, talking about the anti-imperialist struggles in the global South. King starts doing it kind of towards the end of his life.
Mhm. Yeah, a question that someone actually messaged me personally, and it kind of ties into what someone just put in the chat. Someone asked me, do you think Dr. King would have coordinated more with radical leaders if he would have lived longer? Or do you think he would have pursued more radical goals after achieving the Civil Rights Act? And someone similarly kind of said something similar, saying that, oh, if you look at kind of the trend of his stance in the Vietnam War, kind of shows he had more of an international understanding, and they're saying
Yeah.
he may have stronger Palestinian stance in the future. So could you explore that a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was he was already talking about hooking up with Malcolm. They'd had some interactions and they'd met one time. And he also had stopped condemning people for violent behavior in the streets in the north, because he said you can't condemn these people and tell them not to be angry when you're committing, economic and physical violence against them. So yes, I think that he was evolving as a figure. Some would say he was becoming more militant. I don't know if that's kind of strong language, because he did not abandon his commitment for nonviolence, because this was like a religious belief that he had. But I think that yes, he was moving towards working more, not only with people who are more radical and even militant, but he is also going more into the realm of economic justice. So the march that he was planning next was going to be a poor man's march, or the Poor People's March on Washington, which was carried out anyway by Ralph Abernathy, but it just flopped. But he was kind of going after, race, economic injustice, because he read it correctly that historically in the United States, race has been an excellent tool for the elites to use to keep poor and working class people from pushing for, economic justice, right? He recognized this and he was trying to devise a way to get over that hump, like Fred Hampton did the same. It's been insurmountable in the history of this country. No one's ever been able to really do that in a meaningful way.
We have a question here. I really like this one. Can you talk a little bit about the way that Black militancy, whether nationalists, self-defense groups, or urban uprisings, contributed to or allowed for MLK's agenda to be successful? It's a little bit lengthy. The second part is, can you also talk about some of the benefits / victories / social welfare programs that came about due to the state's increasing need to do something to stave off potential revolution / rebellions?
Okay. Let me deal with the first part.
That's like 3 in 1.
Yeah, so the first question is, how did the militants help his cause? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I believe it's something like, like how did like self-defense groups and urban uprisings and kind of this option of like a kind of more terrifying, more harsher, not as stingy and compassionate existed. How did that kind of create this dynamic tension with him?
Well, okay, there's a couple things. I have heard there has been this argument that King, that specifically, I remember Malcolm started saying, you better start listening to King, because you don't listen to King, then you're gonna have to deal with us. And this is after he had left the nation. This was kind of what he was putting out there to white folks, right? Number one. Number two, so King wasn't everywhere all the time in the South. There were a lot of places in the South, I believe, like northern Louisiana, parts of Mississippi. That book, We Will Shoot Back, talks about this, where King didn't go. There was no nonviolent movement, and men got together with their rifles and defended themselves. And even in Birmingham, Alabama, they stopped white folks from doing drive-bys just by forming rifle clubs and opening up on a few of them cats. So self-defense was always there, even in the South, even as King was doing his nonviolent campaigns. I think the problem was the FBI and the feds were just as scared as militants as they were of King. So I'm not sure that the militants furthered his cause. I can't say that they did. I feel like, and I'm a foreign policy historian, so maybe I'm biased, but I think there's a lot of other folks believe that a lot of the motivation for the federal government to do something about the Jim Crow laws, because they were so blatant, was they was trying to win over the global South, specifically Africa, in the post-World War era. They're trying to keep them, they're trying to make the argument that they're the beacon of freedom, and the Soviets are the epitome of, oppression. And the Soviets are making, not that the Soviets were like all anti-racist, but they played at it. You know, they were helping out Cuba, they were helping out Castro, they were helping out Angolan freedom fighters in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, etc. So I would think that that had more of an impact to worry about the Cold War in terms of legislative victories than the fact that there were militants. I mean, and Allah knows best. That's been my observation. What was the second part of the question?
The second part is, can you also talk about some of the benefits / victories in regards to social welfare programs that came about due to the state's increasing need to do something to stave off potential revolution / rebellions?
Oh yeah, so yeah, I mean the Panthers deserve a lot of credit for that. I mean the free breakfast that came from the Panthers. Things like that, free breakfast programs. You know, I would say Head Start. The Panthers were basically you know, opening these freedom schools and that sort of thing. I think affirmative action comes from, but the thing is, this doesn't come from King. This comes from the action of young militants in the urban centers, right?
Mhm.
So I would say those are, I mean, but here's the problem with calling those victories, right? The problem is you take something like the breakfast program, which is run by people in the community, feeding people in the community, and you turn it over to the schools, right? And then you're then at the mercy of the government as to whether or not they're going to cut those programs, or what the quality of food is going to be, or if somebody's going to embezzle or steal food for the line, you know what I'm saying? And it's the same with you know, affirmative action. We had it, now it's gone. It's definitely going to be gone now, right? And so on the one hand, you get these successes, but the successes are dependent upon the goodwill of a mostly white electorate. And that's why my observation and because of my identity as a Muslim, I argue that we have to create our own institutions. We should not worry. For example, I was saying how, you know, Texas and Florida, they literally, in the name of stopping CRT, critical race theory, they're not going to teach Black history no more. So you know what? We should be teaching our people Black history in our homes, right? And not just Black history, Chicano history, the history of the dispossession of the indigenous people, and the atrocities committed against the Chinese Americans. We need to be teaching our children their history through an Islamic perspective at home. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, I mean, I guess I see those. Are they victories? They are, but they're very tenuous because you're constantly relying on a system that you don't have a lot of power in. And there's not much likelihood you're going to have a lot of power in order to preserve those institutions.
Mhm.
So I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, I think I don't see any more questions. If I didn't mention your question, just go ahead and drop it in the chat one more time if you can, and we'll revisit it. But with that, I think there was something else I've kind of had in my mind for a little bit. And you mentioned the book We Will Shoot Back, which is you mentioned the book We Will Shoot Back, which is we're actually about to be reading in February for Black History Month. And in this book, yeah, they kind of explore these themes that you talked about of, you know, Black folks in these communities in the South who already had traditions of armed self-defense. And they explore this little told history of how these groups, in many cases, actually facilitated, you know, quote unquote, nonviolent activists, especially from SNCC and CORE, to engage in organizing activities. And I think another thing a lot of people don't know is that Dr. King actually had an armed guard. So could you talk a little bit about, you know, kind of this balance of how armed Black groups may have played a role in the civil rights movement that's not quite as known about?
Well, I mean, it's the Deacons for Defense, for example. Of course, when you think about the FOI, although unfortunately they killed each other a lot more than they protected the community, but the fact that consciousness was there, that you're in a vulnerable position, right? That there's been centuries of terrorism directed towards your community, it's common sense to basically be able to defend yourself, which under their own system, they say is a constitutional right. So, I think it's, when we look, for example, and I don't want to get too much on a soapbox about this, we looked at contemporary times. I talked about the 3%ers. I talked about the Oath Keepers. These organizations are arming themselves. These organizations are training themselves. And I want you to really think about, what are they arming and training themselves for? If you're African American, if you're Muslim, if you're Latino, you need to be aware that there's a history of when white men get together and start arming and training themselves. They're not imagining that they're going to be invaded, right? And that being the case, we need to actively have we actively have security in our community, and I mean physical security. And I keep, may Allah protect us, but after what happened in New Zealand, I think that it boggles my imagination that every masjid in the country does not have armed security. I don't understand this, and I especially don't understand when I say that people think I'm an extremist or I'm being unreasonable. A man walked into a masjid and murdered 70 people. So I think that, I think that non-violence is actually the outlier. It's actually abnormal, non-violent response to violence. The healthy and the human and thing to do is to defend your family, defend your home, defend your community against violence. And we are human beings, and that's a fundamental right given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even the United States acknowledges that's a God-given right. They exercised it, and we should exercise it. And I think, again, this is what staved off a lot of the brutality and a lot of the violence of white supremacist terrorists in the South in the 60s and right up into the 1970s.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would just once again just like to plug what we're doing.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Because I see there's some more questions in here.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I think there's it's the one we already asked, and then we have one new one.
Okay.
Someone they would agree with what the brother Muhammad had said about Dr. King. Real quick before the last question. Yeah, and if anyone wants to learn more about these, our Black History Month reading group is actually going to be reading a book, We Will Shoot Back, which is about exactly what we've been talking about, and then reading 2 essays by the late Russell Maroon Shoatz, rahimahullah, exploring Maroon communities, which were autonomous communities of Africans who had escaped slavery and were living in the wilderness and for many generations just lived independently and were able to defend themselves against, like white supremacist violence and imperialism. So let's go to this last question, and we'll, and you can sign up for that on our Instagram. The link is in our bio to sign up. This last question, we'll close with this. It's from Muhammad. As America on a global stage begins to wane in influence, do you see that reflecting any change domestically, particularly in terms of race? There's a lot in that one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say something that sounds very pessimistic. And I say these things often hoping that I'm wrong. I don't hope for these things to happen. But I think that like many empires that are in decline, and especially this one, because the legacy, the history of this empire is soaked in blood. As much as I understand for some people it's really uncomfortable to hear that, but this is the truth. The genocidal impulse of this nation is strong, it's powerful. So I think as the United States decline and wanes in influence globally, you're going to see more political violence, specifically directed at us. You're going to see attempts at the preservation of white privilege, not just politically, but socially and culturally. Things are going to get really, really tight. And I think that, so in terms of race, I think they're going to get better and they're going to get worse. They can get better because if we as Muslims, I sincerely believe, like Malcolm says, that Islam is the only thing that can save people in the United States. I'm not saying it's going to save the United States, but it can save us, right? And it can help us deal with this issue of race. We've been a so-called multiracial ummah before the idea of race was even invented, right? We've always had people of different ethnicities. For goodness sake, Salah ad-Din was a Kurd, you know what I'm saying? And so we have an incredible opportunity here, especially y'all, because y'all are young. We need to be the go-to people where people can come to where there's sanity, there's peace, there's justice, there's love, right? We need to be building schools. We need to be building health clinics. We need to be living together. We need to be doing business with one another. And we need to be speaking out against injustice and acting against racial injustice too. And I would say do simple things like, man, get out your comfort zone. Be friends with somebody who isn't from your country or your parents' country or your grandparents' country or isn't from your ethnicity. Get to know that person. Bond with that person across in a spiritual sense with the with the common spiritual tradition that we have. And it's a beautiful tradition. Our book is clear about this. So things can get better if us Muslims step up and do what we're supposed to do. Stop trying to integrate into these Kafir systems that are failing, interning for congressmen and running for office or whatever. That has its place, whatever, and I'm not saying those are bad people. I think they probably have the best of intentions. But what we really need to be doing is building our own institutions. And if we do that, then things will get better in the United States. If we don't, then we're just going to go down with the ship, And God forbid, may Allah preserve us from this. We'll end up with grandchildren talking about I had a Muslim grandfather. We don't want that to happen. So that's the best answer I can give to that question. Yeah, definitely create our own food supply. Everybody should own one chicken. Chickens are amazing. You get 2 or 3 chickens. That's like enough eggs for, a small family every week, and they don't cost a lot of money to have them. So
yeah, I believe there's actually a really interesting study that took place in I think Belgium, where the government subsidized people getting chickens. Yeah. Google the government in Belgium subsidizing people getting chickens.
It'll cut your garbage down by like 75% if you have chickens.
Yeah, it was crazy. And
you have great compost, and then you're producing food for yourself. You're beginning the road down to self-sufficiency. Take that compost, you got a garden. Next thing you know, get you a goat. You can do this even in Oakland. I had chickens in Oakland for years. Right, Jihad? Y'all grew up with chickens.
Yeah. Now the next Al Justed event is going to be a DIY chicken raising workshop. All right. So alhamdulillah alameen wa salatu salam ala sayyidina anbiya al-mursalin nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ya Allah Ta'ala, please unite all of our hearts. Please unite our hearts upon the Quran and the Sunnah. Please purify our intentions. Please bring us together to build jami'an, to build communities, and to worship you for the sake of worshiping you and for the sake of reviving the Sunnah. Subhanallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Inshallah, tap in on our Instagram. If you don't have an Instagram, have someone message the Instagram for you, and maybe you can get on our WhatsApp for the reading group. And just stay tapped in. And we are having another event on the 28th of this month, I believe, with Amir Abdul Malik on the role of youth in social movement. Our reading group is going to be starting on, I believe, it's starting the first week of February. And we're going to be reading We Will Shoot Back, and then 2 essays by Russell Moon Shoatz, rahimahullah. And yeah, get yourself a chicken, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and I appreciate your questions.
And thank you very much for coming and speaking. We always appreciate your words of wisdom. And if anyone wants to follow Dr. Omar or his work or his writings, you can follow him on Twitter. What was your Twitter again?
I can't remember. I'm on academia.edu too. I'm not a big social media person, but
I know. Let me just plug your Twitter for 1 month. You can tweet out your academia.edu.
I don't know it. If you just look at my name, it comes up.
I know it. It's at Abu Imad bin H.
There you go.
I'm gonna drop it in the chat. You guys can get it. Yeah. All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Have a good day.
Assalamu alaikum.